there was an all hands meeting going on, and most of the people on my team were sitting in the situation room. And the situation room happens to have all these monitors around it with the dashboards. We don't usually use them for anything, right? Because no one, like, it's just cycling through those dashboards, and he sees these those errors. Like, wait, those are bad, right? Now I'm not in that. So I'm on call. I'm not in that room. I'm like, no, I'm not going to be like remote. Like, I want to go actually to where the all hands meeting is, right? So I'm in the all hands meeting. They're watching the all hands meeting from the situation room. But my teammate sees this. Paige is on call, who's me. So they're watching me stand up. They're watching me look at my phone, stand up, and then come back to the situation room.
Welcome to the Software Misadventures podcast, where we sit down with software and DevOps experts to hear their stories from the trenches about how software breaks in production. We are your hosts, Ronak, Austin, and Guang. We've seen firsthand how stressful it is when something breaks in production, but it's the best opportunity to learn about a system more deeply. When most of us started in this field, we didn't really know what to expect, and wish there were more resources on how veteran engineers overcame the daunting task of debugging complex systems. In these conversations, we discuss the principles and practical tips to build resilient software, as well as advice to grow as technical leaders.
Hello everyone, this is Guang. Our guest for this episode is Lorin Hochstein. Lorin is a senior software engineer at Netflix, where he worked on chaos and reliability engineering, and is now on the managed delivery team. In this chat, we hear about how Lorin got into chaos engineering, his favorite incident story, what engineers can gain from writing better, and why some metrics might not be as useful as you think. Please enjoy this lively and educational conversation with Lorin Hochstein. Awesome. Well, Lorin, welcome to the show.
All right, I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. So starting from kind of the beginning, so you got a PhD from University of Maryland in computer science, and then after that, you actually went to academia and spent some time working as a professor before coming to the dark side and moving into industry. What was that transition like?
Yeah, I really thought I wanted to be a professor. It's funny, when I was a kid, so my dad's a professor. And my mom is an elementary school teacher. And when I was a kid, I was like, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to be an educator. I'm not going to be a professor. I'm going to do my own thing. I got a degree in computer engineering. I got a job right out of school. I was working for a little startup in Montreal. And then I was like, wait a minute, I actually do want to be a professor. And so after 18 months, I moved to the US and I, went to grad school, got my PhD. Applied to 40 different schools to get a job as a professor. I got 2 interviews, 2 offers, and I got it. And I was not happy there. I was very, very stressed out when I got that job.
Wait.
I was worried.
I think this will be a good advice for my parents in terms of how they could have convinced me to go to medical school. So what did it change? Why did you change your mind that you decided, hey, maybe professorship is actually what I want? At the earlier time.
Yeah, I really like school. I really like learning stuff. I liked research. I was just interested in it. I actually started out my PhD program in electrical engineering, and then I switched to computer science because I really liked signal processing. I just love that stuff. I really enjoyed college. I mean, it's really weird, but when I retire, I'm probably going to spend time just going back to school and just taking classes because I just really like that. And so when you really like, academic stuff, academia is a natural place to think you want to spend your time. And that's what sort of flipped me.
I see. What made it stressful? Was it the teaching aspect or having to do the grants, the more procedural stuff?
Sure. The grants was probably the thing that was most stressful to me. Teaching was stressful. I mean, I'm an introvert and you have to stand up there and, do a lecture all the time, but you get used to that in academia. You can't even get through grad school if you can't, get up in front of people and speak. I learned how to stay one lecture ahead of the students when I first graded classes. Which was interesting. But one of the challenges, I like education, although I'm not a big fan of lecturing. But, so what was frustrating to me was the grant stuff. It's very hard to get grants. The accept rate for the NSF, at least at the time, was like 4%. I was not in a particularly hot area. My research area is empirical software engineering, so it's like actually studying software engineers as they do work. And I was stressed out all the time about it. And I couldn't spend as much time on like teaching stuff as I wanted to because I had to spend time on research stuff. And I just wasn't like enjoying the work because I was constantly worried that like I wouldn't get grants, which would mean I wouldn't get tenure, which would mean that I would like basically be fired from my job and have to go somewhere else after 6 years. I had just had my first child was born right when I moved to Nebraska. We didn't know anyone out there. My wife and I were like, we're coasters, right? So we're both from the East Coast, now on the West Coast. Midwest is not like culturally is not a good fit for us. We didn't know anybody. So like there's a confluence. It's never one thing, right? So there's like a confluence of different factors. And in the end, I was like, well, like, what am I doing here if I don't really like this work? Like I'm fortunate enough to be in a field where there actually is industry work, right? If I had gotten a PhD in so my brother has a PhD in philosophy and he's a philosophy professor now. And you know, there's not that much else you can do for a PhD in philosophy, but with like, at least in software, you can go out into industry. And so at some point I'm just like, what am I doing here? I'm not happy. And I started to look into other options and I slowly transitioned from academia into industry.
Interesting. Like, did you have to like do the whole like get the how to crack the coding interview book, or was that because you already had like a really solid you already had a very solid background, right? So but what was that prep like, I guess?
I don't know if the book was out at that point, so we're talking about 2008. I don't know if the crack and coding interview book had been published yet. I applied to Google. I could not get through the tech screen. I remember in a Google Doc doing programming and doing terribly. Like I didn't do that much coding when I was a professor, and I certainly was not practiced at doing like live coding kind of stuff. And so the first job I got out of when I left the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I went to a research lab. And so there's this whole world of these research lab things that people don't know about unless they're in academia, where they're sort of attached to universities, but the people who work there are not professors, they're not faculty, they're staff, and they're typically funded through the research grants or contracts that research lab is getting money for. So when I was a PhD student, I was on my advisor had a project funded that was paying for my PhD. And there's a whole bunch of other organizations that had funding. It was like from DARPA, and there's like a whole bunch of other people involved. And one of these organizations was called ISI. It's still called ISI, the Information Sciences Institute. It's a research lab out of University of Southern California. Most people have not heard of it, but like that's where DNS was invented. So they had a big role in the early internet. I never heard of it until I was a PhD student. And then when I was looking around, I was like, oh, I heard of this ISI thing. Why don't I apply there? So I applied there. Because it was more of an academic-y place that hires PhDs, I did not have to go through a code screen. It was more like an academic job interview where you go and give a talk, right? A job talk. That's the difference, right? Academia, I would say the work much more stressful, but the interviewing much easier because by the time you get to the interview process, your odds of getting in are very good. It's basically just if there's someone else in the pipeline who's, a little better than you, that's it. Whereas in industry, it's like, we don't know whether you're any good or not because we don't have any like bar in advance. Maybe if we hired you from another FANG company, but even then, like even when we hire people from FANG companies, we still make them jump through these hoops. So it's much less stressful to apply to an academic-y place. And so I did a job talk. I got a job there. My title, I love this, was computer scientist. So I have a PhD in computer science. I have worked literally as a computer scientist. I still could not tell you what computer science is, like how to define it, but I'm very well credentialed to talk about it. And so that ISI, so I worked there for a while, and then my boss and skip level, they left to form a startup, and I left and joined them. And since they knew me already, I did not have to tech screen, right? I just got there. And then, I don't know if you want me to keep going, but basically then I was working there. It was a startup. And I was working there during the government shutdown that happened. I don't know if you remember that, but this is in DC a while ago. We were funded through government contracts, and my paycheck started getting later and later. And my wife was like, we got to eat here. And so I left and I got a job, ironically, through my brother-in-law, who was a VP at SendGrid at the time. So I was working, he was running SendGrid Labs, which was like a little, piece of SendGrid that was doing like new product development. So I moved to Rhode Island. And I did have to go through a tech screen. I did have to go through the regular, process to get a job there. And I lucked out because the problem I had practiced the night before, that person happened to ask me in the tech screen. I told him, like, it was like the shuffle problem. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, right? Like, how do you do a perfect shuffle of a deck of cards? And there's a well-known algorithm. And I'm like, I told him, like, I've just practiced this. Are you sure you want me to do this? He said, yeah. I said, okay. So,
Nice.
And I just blew the problem away because I had just done it.
Did any of the process of interviewing ever make you feel that, maybe I should go back to academia and not go to tech, because like you have to go through all these hoops to just go through the interview?
I found the interview frustrating. I still do. I'm like not a big fan of the way tech interviews are done, but I like the work of industry more. So like, I really don't like how to get in there, but I really enjoy one of the things I like a lot more in industry is the team aspect. Like when you're in academia, you're sort of like an entrepreneur. You have some people who report to you, grad students, but really you're out to make a name for yourself. And so you're on your own. The incentives are all for you to do like individual work. Whereas in industry, you're always working on some kind of product together with a team, right? It's not about you as an individual. It's about like you're working together for something, to build something. And I like that. I work much better in that kind of environment. So like while I still am very academically minded, like I have I run like the paper reading group at Netflix. I still like the day-to-day work in industry a lot more.
Nice. And then that's sort of, I guess, right after that, that's how you got into Netflix, or what drew you to Netflix?
Yeah. Well, I was at SendGrid Labs, and we'd actually moved to Rhode Island for family reasons, and then those reasons were my wife is from Rhode Island, and then those reasons were no longer relevant. There was nothing keeping us there anymore. My wife actually does not really like living in Rhode Island, even though she's from there, or maybe because she's from there. I was fine with it, but I had no particular attachment to Rhode Island. Our kids are getting a little bit older. I'd never worked in Silicon Valley. And I said, this is really our last chance to try something like that. This was before the days you could, work remotely for any company like you can now. And so I just basically applied to all websites to different FANG companies. I didn't have any contacts really at any of them. And so, I applied to all the FANGs. I failed the tech screens at Facebook and LinkedIn. I got an offer from Amazon. Google kind of screwed up the process with me. I got through the tech screen, but they never managed to schedule an onsite because the recruiter wasn't that good, I think. And Netflix, had an opening on the Chaos team. And I thought like, that's really cool. I'd heard of Chaos Monkey. And that sounded really exciting to me. And I got an offer there, and I didn't even want to wait to see what would happen with Google. I was just like, yeah, like Amazon, I had heard like, they use blood to power the machine. So I was a little afraid of going to Amazon. And so, yeah, right.
Sorry.
Good question,
Anyways, so a couple episodes back, we actually spoke with Tammy from Gremlin, and we were actually talking about how cool the Netflix Chaos Con, I think that was the demo for, at AWS reInvent one year. And so yeah, I think that's been inspiration to a lot of us. And I was curious, like, so for you guys, y'all been doing resilience engineering for a long time at Netflix. How has that like changed, like evolved over time?
Yeah, it started out with with the Chaos Monkey stuff. I mean, it's been going on for a really long time, right? So I can talk about what happened since I've been there. So when I got there about 6 years ago, Chaos Monkey was there. The person who had developed it initially had left, and so another team had sort of owned it and wasn't crazy about owning this legacy thing that had been like updated through open source, but we weren't really using some of the open source stuff in it. The Kong stuff is interesting. That's like the traffic failover, which now got broken out into a separate team. Demand engineering runs all that stuff now. It used to be like traffic and chaos were together. And then there was some more sophisticated fault injection stuff that was developed by the guy who started Gremlin, Colton Andrus, built in a lot of sort of smarter fault injection between microservices at Netflix. So basically, all the libraries all the apps had these libraries linked in that you could say, okay, fail this call between, one service and another. And so they would do experiments of what happens if we fail. So there are some non-critical services at Netflix, that are they add value to the customer experience, but they're not critical to be able to watch a movie. So for example, the bookmark service that remembers where you were when you were last watching something, if that fails, you would not expect to prevent you from watching. You just expect it for, a reasonable thing would just start at the beginning again, right? And so with this failure injection framework, we're able to so surgically fail calls for either one particular device or for, I think, a percentage. And then when I got there, they started building an experimentation framework on top of that was more sophisticated, right? Because it was really it was really tricky to do those experiments, because if you only injected a little bit of failure, you couldn't really see at the metrics whether you were actually having impact to customers or not. We would basically do a chaos experiment and look to see, are people still able to watch, right? That was we have a metric called SPS, which is a rate of how often people are pressing the start button and they're actually, successfully able to stream a video. So that's our our KPI, our top level metric. If that drops, things are bad. It sort of goes in a sine wave-ish kind of thing throughout the course of the day, because people watch more in the evening than in the morning, but it doesn't move dramatically quickly. So if it drops, that's our alerts fire. And so doing these chaos experiments, if we would inject some failure, if it was a lot, that's really bad, but a little bit, it was really hard to tell. And so when I was there, they built a system called CHAP, which is an experimentation platform where you could affect a very specific subset of traffic, a small fraction, and watch what happens to only those users. And so it was much more fine-grained. We had graphs just on the people who are being affected. We could use sort of traditional experimentation models where you have a treatment and a control. I built an auto stop system, so if it seemed it would usually run for a while, I don't know, 30 minutes or something. But we could detect in a couple minutes if there's a big drop in the treatment group and just stop it. So there's a lot of sophistication that went into doing that building that kind of experimental platform, so we could be a little more sort of surgical. But it turned out that okay, you could run an experiment and you fail this thing, or you added latency here and there's some impact. Well, now what, right? What's the problem? We don't know. We can't tell you that. And is it worth chasing up on that? Right. So there's this whole problem of fault localization, which is another whole area, which was not what we were built for. Right. And that's the observability movement, I would say, that sort of blossomed over the past few years is really focused on that now, right? It's on fault local, where's the problem when something goes wrong? But we didn't have great fault localization tools, and so it was hard to get uptake. We tried to do some automatic stuff, right? So we're gonna run a bunch of automatic experiments, but then still okay, something went wrong. What do we do with that? And so we built some cool tooling, but it ended up being difficult to use that sort of automated tooling in practice because it required a lot of interpretation of the data, to an investigation to see whether there was actually a problem or not. And then there's so many different experiments you could run. So I left that team. It's been about 4 years now. It was the chaos team. Now it's called the resilience team. And they're doing some other things now. They're doing some more, they're not just doing fault injection. They're using that framework to do other things canary analysis. They're doing some more sophisticated stuff there. They use it for load testing. So they've sort of built on it to do things other than failure testing. So it sort of evolved over time to do different kinds of sort of infrastructure experimentation rather than just break things and just inject failure and see whether we can handle it. The chaos monkey stuff is still there. But it doesn't catch that many things because we now know how to build these services to, every so often someone will, do something accidentally stateful that shouldn't be, but most of the time, it's just fine.
I'm curious, for even when you're doing the sub-selecting or sub-sampling sort of specific types of traffic in order to do the injection, was that difficult because you would need to kind of have the domain expertise to kind of know that, okay, for this type of errors that we want to inject, it only affects, this sort of traffic. Was that a thing, or it was pretty straightforward?
Well, the nice thing about Netflix is we have enough traffic that like, even if we do a small, like, let's say I'm going to fail calls to the, the food service here, and I'm like randomly sampling at the edge, right? And I don't know if they're actually going to call. Maybe no calls will go from the people who are tagged. So we're tagging, in a way that we remember who we tagged, a bunch of people to say, okay, you're the ones we're going to inject failure on. They might not end up going there. But usually we have enough there's so much traffic coming in, going to all these services, that we get enough that we get, statistically significant results. So just because there's just so much stuff coming in, we can be kind of random. Like we can random samples, like small amounts, and it ends up being like a decent count of traffic, that we can often get a pretty decent signal. And we have a knob, we can turn it up, like, there's like nothing coming in here, to this service, in this group, so we can try to increase the number of people we're sampling.
That's pretty neat. Like one thing that, as you were talking about some of the challenges with just doing chaos engineering or resilience engineering, even at Netflix, where I think this idea, well, I don't know who popularized the idea, but like Netflix has been doing this for a while. It's been a few years, where Chaos Monkey, I think, was 2013, 12, sometime around that. And even so, like you mentioned, if you don't have the fault localization tools or the observability tools, it's hard to know what to do with the data that you found out, or even dig in and say, okay, there's the problem, that's what we need to fix. There are various orgs today who see this pattern in the industry now, where like chaos engineering, for instance, is a thing that people want to do a lot more of. But from an engineering perspective, it sounds really cool to do. But from a business standpoint, the question comes back to, so how does it add value? Like if you did this, then how are you going to identify what to fix? And if you do that, how is it going to help the business baseline? Because do we build stuff or do we break stuff and figure out how to improve it? So like for folks who are still trying to think about doing chaos engineering, do you have any like ideas or perspective on how they can go about thinking about this? Like whether it makes sense to invest right now or build some tooling first?
Yeah. The funny thing is I'm kind of in the other camp at this point. So when I was on the chaos team, what would happen is I would look over at like what was happening like with the actual incidents. Yeah. And I would say, wow, like that's a lot more interesting. Like the real stuff that's happening, that's more interesting than the synthetic stuff where we, do a little thing and like we don't know what, like the big things, like those, like there's a lot there. And like every time I looked at those, I was like, wow, I've like learned so much about what's going on in the system. And one of the reasons the team name changed from chaos to resilience is that like resilience engineering is traditionally more about like, if you look at like the academic field, is more about like studying real incidents. And so I wanted to do that. And so I was like, well, why don't we, change the focus of the team, to spend time doing that. And then I ended up leaving the team and moving over to the incident management team. So like, I don't know, like I don't want to dump on chaos engineering, but like I would say that like, I think you should invest more of your time looking at your real incidents. Like, I think you will learn about, I found it has been a better ROI because like it's just like it's a lot of engineering effort to build up the tooling around it and then learning how to, I mean, there's some value in learning how to like think about through the experiments and stuff, but I don't know if the ROI is there, to be honest with you. And like it's one of the reasons I don't not in that space anymore. I'm like it's a cool thing. I'm glad we tried it, but like the real incidents are where it's at. Like that's the stuff where like you're gonna learn stuff and like they're gonna keep coming. Like you don't have to make them happen.
All right. Moving on to the next topic. So you are you were then transitioned to the core team, which I believe stands for Core Operations and Reliability Engineering. So that seems a lot more sort of broader and more horizontal in terms of scope than other SRE teams. Like, how did that work?
Yeah, the chaos/resilience team and the core team were both in the same org. They were like managed by the same director. So it was, and actually it was the same, there were two manager gaps. So it was actually the same manager, like the director was managing both teams. And I looked over and I was just sort of like, I want to do incident analysis and it doesn't really, it's not really within the scope of my current team. Like the core team is a centralized incident management team. I don't know what it originally stand for. Every so often they change what the acronym means. I think it's like critical operations and reliability engineering is what it is today. I don't know what it first stood for. But they're a centralized incident management team that is also responsible for the follow-up, the incident analysis. And I wanted to do the incident analysis, so I moved over there. But like the SREs that are on call are the ones that do the analysis, at least at the time. So I had to, become like an SRE and go on call. Like I'm not an SRE. I guess I have like an SRE skill set at this point in my career. That's never been my title. But I had to, so I actually kept my title. I was like the only senior software engineer on that team when I moved over. All the other ones were SREs, senior SREs. But I had to do the same kind of work. So I moved over to that team. So that team doesn't own any services of their own. Right. So Netflix is like you build it, you run it. So each of the teams that develops the microservice is responsible for operating it. But the core team sort of owns the top level, like alerts and dashboards. So if all of a sudden, like, a lot of people in Canada are not able to, stream video on their smart TVs, like the alert will go off, like a core alert will go off, and they sort of do coordination, and incident management, right? They'll page people in. They're pretty adept at tracking through dashboards to figure out, okay, what's the source of this particular, stream of errors that's coming back. They do handle communications, with PR and the rest of the organization. And so that's what they do. So you have a bunch of people who are sitting around sort of ready to do that sort of work.
That makes sense. On the core side, it's interesting how the team does incident management and analysis centrally. So from an incident management perspective, I think different companies have they call them different teams, but there is a team where you'll have like an incident commander, for instance, who will page in and page people out, kind of make sure the summary goes out to the execs and the stakeholders. What's interesting is one part of the role that you mentioned is the incident analysis as well. So since the core team doesn't own a lot of the services that they're built by other teams, like what role and how do they play that role in the incident analysis aspect when working with these multiple teams?
Well, it's changed a little bit over time, I would say. Like historically, they've been responsible for like memorialization of the incident. So we use Jira to track these things.
Same at LinkedIn.
and I mean, it checks the boxes, right?
Yes.
Like it does what you need it to do.
People have a love-hate relationship, but it works out.
Yeah. So they're responsible for writing up that ticket, and often that description will be like relatively brief, not a huge amount of detail. They're enough so that someone on the core team who's looking can look and see what the graphs look like, and so they can get some experience with like the particular failure mode. And typically the incident commander will organize the IR meeting. So there's an incident review meeting. They'll bring the people involved together. And then often the teams that own individual services will do write-ups, right? So there'll be like an open Q&A doc where people will add questions and answers. Individual teams might do some write-ups either like on their own or contribute to a larger one. So that's typically how it was done. What I wanted to do was I wanted to go in and like talk to a whole bunch of people who were involved and figure out like, okay, like how did the system get into that state? When the incident was happening, like how did you find out? What did you see? What were you thinking? Right? Like they had not historically been doing that. And they had only been looking at, incidents that were like customer impacting, right? If something happened that was like not a customer impacted thing, maybe I would see an email go from some other team that said, hey, our internal service had some outage here at this point in time, right? It affected internal customers, but not. And I was like, well, what happened there? That seems interesting. Like, I want to know, right? The first one that I saw was like, I think a system that like figures out like what ads to show. Like, Netflix doesn't show ads on our service, but we, buy ads to show on the internet. And I think there's some service that figures out what ads to show people, and it had failed, and so there was a fallback. So like there was no even impact. But I was like, that's really interesting there. Like, what happened? And I talked to them, and it was really fascinating to see all the different things that had to happen for that failure mode to happen. But that was not in the scope of core at the time. And so like, I just wanted to dig in, and like no one else was doing it. And then like, so I moved over, and my, colleague at the time, Nora Jones, who was on the Chaos Resilience team, she moved over with me like a month later to core. She was doing a master's degree at Lund University. They have like a safety science degree. So she was really into it too. So the two of us moved over, and we, tried to do some deeper analysis stuff, and we ended up like opening up new positions. So we hired J. Paul Reed is on that team now. He's like his official title, I think, is applied resilience engineer, right? And he's not on call. Like he is able to, right? I really like that. He's able to spend all his time doing the analysis. He's not responsible for being on call. And like, if you read the literature, they're like, if you're involved in the incident, you're really not supposed to be the one doing the follow-up stuff, because like each person will have a different perspective, and your perspective is going to change the way you look at it. And you need to get each individual person's perspective to really learn as much as you can about the incident.
Wow. That is so fascinating. And it's fascinating because, it's unique, at least from my personal experience. I mean, at LinkedIn and some of the other folks that I've spoken to, many times the person who's on call, or let's say was involved in the incident itself, is writing up, like, for the lack of a better word, some people call it postmortem docs or the incident reports, for instance. They organize like the timeline and all of these data points. But it's so interesting, what you said, that the person involved shouldn't be the one necessarily doing the analysis later on, because different people have different perspectives. So I'm curious, like, what kind of things you found in those reports when they got written by people who weren't directly involved in the incident, or is that how it worked?
Yeah, well, what would happen is you would see the world from different people's points of view to describe what happened in the incident. Right. And so that was really interesting. So like historically what happens is when you like the world of the incident would start when the first alert would go off, would be how the traditional write-ups would happen. But then like when you started talking to people, you would find out that like sort of the seeds had been planted sometimes like months or years before. Right. And you see how that change made sense at the time. And this other change happens over here, which they didn't know about. And these things interact. And so you found out that like this person didn't know something that somebody else knew at the time, or the opposite. I mean, one of the things that I love about this stuff is watching how experts resolve incidents, right? We talk a lot about, okay, like we don't want to blame people for their mistakes, but like incidents are an opportunity for people to like really do well at like at operating at a very, very difficult situations, right? And there are people like in every organization. I mean, Netflix is a great place. I love the people there, but like every organization, there are some really, really good people. And the opportunity to like watch them work is amazing. And if you can capture like a story of what they saw and like how they dealt with the problem, in the moment, like you can learn from that in a way that's sort of similar to how you can learn from your own experience. And that's one thing I've really wanted to capture in these sorts of write-ups.
That's so true. We had Ryan Underwood on the show in one of the first few episodes, and he was on the same team as me. He's moved on from LinkedIn, but he was one of those engineers who, if there is, let's say, for example, an incident or a bug, people would gather around his desk just to shoulder surf and see what he was seeing and the commands that he was using. And we've asked him to record his like teamwork sessions or screen sessions, and they are still an artifact shared across the team saying, okay, this is how you debug a disk issue when you have disk pressure on a containerized environment. So I can completely relate to what you're saying. But at times, we also found this challenging to do many times, because it's like, okay, someone's dealing with an incident or they're going through all these things, and the first response they have is, can I just go fix it? And many times, like, people go back and do these write-ups where they'll describe exactly what they saw, capture all these artifacts so that the rest of the teams can learn. But then time gets in the way. Priorities get in the way. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on how did your teams at Netflix go about like prioritizing this sort of work, where it's like, let's capture the thing and learn from it instead of not reflecting on it all the time?
Yeah, that's why I'm an advocate of like actually spending the resources to have someone who's dedicated, whose like job it is to go and talk to people, right? Because it's one thing to ask you to go and like write up your own experience. Like that's going to take you a lot of time, right? And like you said, so the one universal that we all face is that none of us have enough time, right? We are all limited in our resources, and it doesn't matter like what kind of company you work at. It doesn't matter where you are in the org chart. Like no one has enough time to do the work they have to do, right? And so like learning is reflecting is the first thing to go, because you can always cut that out, right? So you need to have like some upfront investment. So that's why but like to go and sit and talk with someone for like half an hour or an hour after an incident, well, like that's part of the culture anyways, right? Like we're expected to like talk. Often there's like we typically have like a meeting, like a big, IR meeting, but like I actually find I get a lot more out of the one-on-ones, right? And so the one-on-ones will be much more expensive for the person doing all those. But for the people on the other side who are talking about their experience, it's a meeting, right? You got meeting. I mean, I don't know what your calendar looks like, but I suspect that like they're, given the size of LinkedIn. Yeah. Right. And so like one more meeting, it's annoying, but like it's not that expensive. The write-ups are still hard, and you have to get better at them over time. I mean, even people who do this like full time, even me doing it, I struggled. I got better over time. But that's why I think there's a real advantage in like having people dedicated to this, because like that is their full-time job. They have the cycles devoted to it. And so you don't have this problem of, well, I would love to do this, but like I just have too many other competing priorities. It's just not the most important thing for my team right now. So I can't.
Makes sense. So in this case, like, is it the role for the applied resilience engineer that you mentioned, who would go and talk to these teams and gather their perspectives, and then like kind of either provide a qualitative analysis of, okay, this is kind of a pattern that we're seeing over and over again in some of the incidents happening across the site?
Yeah. So, two things there. One of them is going and talking to people and doing, about specific incidents. And there's always little things happening all the time that, even with like a full-time resilience engineering analyst, like Paul can't even look at everything, right? Like there's just way too much. But like the great thing about incidents is if you miss one, there's another one, right? So part of it is looking at like individual ones, and the other part is like you said, like sort of aggregating, right? So another thing that Paul does is he has like a risk radar meeting where he actually sort of crowdsources and asks people to provide like what are some risks that you're seeing that we haven't been talking about, and then he has a meeting, and he pulls from the incident write-ups that he's done. Or other people have done, and also just solicits feedback. So like that's one of the challenges, is how do you aggregate these sort of like weak signals of risks that you're getting from different places? And that's one of the roles that he plays.
That's so cool. You might have written some incident write-ups, or maybe a lot more depending upon how many incidents. Do you have any advice for folks on how to go about writing incident reports? I mean, even though not many companies would have like a full-time person to gather this feedback, but if someone's writing this incident report themselves, like the elements that they could borrow to kind of make those more valuable.
Yeah, I would say that the first step, right? Like if you're like, okay, I want to write better incident reports, but I don't know what to do. The thing that I think is probably easiest and most valuable is like talk one-on-one with the people that were involved and just write separate narratives from each of their perspectives about what they saw about the world, right? The hard part is like taking those and, combining them together and picking out themes and contributors. That's hard stuff. It takes a lot of time. But like those narratives alone, you're going to get like a ton of stuff out of there. And so and I found that like once I started to do that, like I would interview someone, I would write an individual narrative for each of them, and then I would do the combining. Like even if you just stopped at the individual, and I didn't actually release the individual narratives, because I would sort of do the synthesis write up where I would like sort of switch back and forth between the different perspectives over time, right? To get like a one story going. Even if you didn't get to that point, if you just had those narratives, like there's just a ton of stuff that's going to come out. And one of the challenges is like whenever you try to abstract, okay, well, like what's interesting here, right? Different things will be interesting to different people, right? Someone who just got hired at your company, reading a narrative is going to take away something completely different than someone who's been there for like 6 years. And you can't know in advance. And so like, I can take away the things that I learned that I didn't know before and abstract those out, but I'm going to be throwing away useful stuff to someone else. But the narrative is the narrative. Like that's just what happened to the person, what they saw, what they were thinking. And I like to go back, reasonably far to like how the system got into that state. Right. The story of what were the code changes or config changes, and what was the motivation for them. Right. And so you have all of these individual stories, and they're great. And I love them. And like people love to read stories.
Yeah.
They don't like reading bullets, but they love stories, right? Like this whole podcast, right, is predicated on the idea,
yes,
to my understanding, that like people love to hear stories about incidents.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So talking about incident stories. You've seen a lot at Netflix. Are there any specific stories you could share with us?
Yeah, I'll tell you about one that stands out, and I'm going to like break the rule of like not doing an analysis of your own incident, because like I was the incident responder for this one on core, and so I didn't even do like a deep write up, but I did like a big crazy timeline on it. So this is like the 100% tracing incident that I was involved in. So Netflix is we have a microservice architecture, and there's like an edge service, like the front door. The service is called Zool. It's open source. It's on GitHub. And so all the requests come into Zool, and then Zool will tag some of them to trace, right? And we have a distributed tracing thing, so we know who's talking to who. We trace normally 1 out of every 1,000 requests, right? So 0.1% of requests get tagged and traced, and then that trace data gets like, pushed into our stream processing system that goes on like a Kafka queue. It gets consumed later on, and you can visualize it and so on. So one day, one of the engineers on the Zool team accidentally he was debugging some kind of tracing issue. So he had it on his local machine running Zool. He had turned the tracing on to 100%. He had switched to another development task, and he didn't realize he'd committed that change, the 100% change. And so it pushed it up with the other change. So he has now pushed up a change where 100% of requests, so like 1,000 times more than we normally handle, are going to get sampled, right? So that goes to Canary, right? So Canary only takes a fraction of traffic, right? And so 100% of that fraction of traffic is getting sampled. The downstream services are fine. They can handle that additional tracing. There are some alerts that fire on the stream processing side, but they're not critical. They're starting to fall behind because like it's a lot more data is coming in than normal, but they're like not like business critical paging things or email alerts and stuff. And happens like at 1 a.m. Then it gets promoted from Canary. So we have like a staging sort of thing, right? So first it's Canary, and then like we run in 3 different Amazon regions, right? That goes to US East 1 first. So like 9:30 in the morning, this gets deployed to US East 1 because the Canary looks good, right? And like the Zool itself is fine, right? Like it's always processing 100%. It's always dealing with all the requests, right? It just happens to be tagging. It goes, and now all of a sudden in US East 1, 100% of requests are being tagged and processed all along the thing, right? So now, all of a sudden, one of our error signals spike. Now it didn't set off an alert yet, but, someone on my team happened to see it because, there was an all hands meeting going on, and most of the people on my team were sitting in the situation room, and the situation room happens to have all these monitors around it with the dashboards. We don't usually use them for anything, right? Because no one, like, it's just cycling through those dashboards, and he sees these those errors. Like, wait, those are bad, right? Now I'm not in that. So I'm on call. I'm not in that room. I'm like, no, I'm not going to be like remote. Like, I want to go actually to where the all hands meeting is, right? So I'm in the all hands meeting. They're watching the all hands meeting from the situation room. But my teammate sees this. Paige is on call, who's me. Yeah. So they're watching me stand up. They're watching me look at my phone, stand up, and then come back to the situation room. And so what's happened is like a bunch of services are like, the CPU is too high. We're getting weird errors. Mm-hmm. It's kind of weirdly distributed throughout the service. Like, but there's no obvious like change that's happened. Yeah. Right? Like, there's not one thing you can point to and say, okay, that's the problem. Mm-hmm. Now, and so at the same time, in parallel, the observability team is like investigating why their alert went off. That like, why are we behind in processing these traces? And then the team that owns the stream processing infrastructure, right, which they're built on top of, their alerts also go off, and they're trying to figure this out. And so the observability guy asks the engineer on Zool, like, who made the change, like, hey, did anything change at 1 a.m.? Okay, because at 1, and he says no, nothing changed. Oh, wow. Okay. And the reason he says that is because so Zool, the way they push is that they have a scheduled push at 4, right? Their Canary goes out at 4 p.m. and he pushed before that. He didn't know that at the time someone had manually started that pipeline, and so his deployment got queued. So his deployment didn't start until 1 a.m, and he didn't know that. Wow. So he's like, no, I pushed yesterday at 4. Our Canaries go out at 4, like 1 o'clock. That's not us. That's not my change, right? So, we don't know what's going on. We're getting like TCP retransmit errors. Some people are saying, oh, there's got to be a networking problem. Let's bring in the networking people, right?
Yeah.
Some people are saying, no, it's not. Just because TCP retransmits are up, that doesn't mean it's a networking issue.
Yeah.
So networking guys come in and he's like, I don't think it's a networking problem. So you mentioned the Chaos Kong, right? So Netflix is able to fail over. So I'm like, I don't know if it was my call in the end, but I was the core on call. So okay, let's fail out. Let's fail out of US East 1. So we move all the traffic out of US East 1 to the other two regions, US West 2 and EU. 30 minutes later, the deployment finishes in US East 1 and it goes to US West 2, right? That deployment pipeline's still running.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh my God, it followed us, right? The problem has followed us to this new region, right? And it just was a coincidence that that's the order in which the stage was happening. Now, in parallel, the stream processing guys are just investigating their, why are we getting so much more, traffic in our Kafka queues? And then another person on my team sees that in the stream processing infrastructure channel, they report like, hey, we're having an issue, right? Like they don't show up in the core channel because they're not really critical stuff, right? They're like operational data. Like if the Kafka stuff breaks, it doesn't affect streaming. Yeah. But one of the core members sees that. He's like, hey, when did you start to see that happen, right? Like what was the timing behind that? And that happened at the same time as we started to see it. And then and then those streams come together, right? And then we realize what's happened. Yeah. And the guy on the observability team, turns down the tracing and everything goes back to normal, right? And so I love this story so much because it has all these combinations of like things people didn't know and then things people did know because they saw certain things, right? Yeah. And so much of incidents are like that, are like these huge systems. There's so many interactions, like no one has the whole picture and we're always going to be missing some critical piece. Yeah. But some people are going to get good at looking and saying, hey, that's important, right? Like, hey, those errors they were a real thing. Hey, like that issue that this, stream processing team is having, like maybe that's connected, right? Like, and so I really love that incident.
Oh, that's an amazing story. And wow, it sounds like a tough day to be on call when you are faced with such an incident. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say. So I thought going in that like it would be much more stressful if like all of a sudden streaming, video watching drops to zero, right? But that's not the stressful part. The stressful ones are the ones that take like hours and hours. You don't know what the problem is. It's sort of something's maybe wrong, and then it goes away, and like, is everything okay? Can we walk away now? Like we don't know. Like if we're in a good state because we don't know why we were in a bad state, and okay, we're fine. And then it recurs like 4 hours later. Man, I can tell you about like Cassandra clusters, getting too hot. Like, oh my God, interactions between client libraries and like the way the data is distributed, and it's just those are the ones that are a nightmare. Like Saturday all day. Those are a nightmare.
Oh yeah, I think whenever an incident happens and it suddenly goes away. I've seen some people like, oh, it went away. But I see the other half of the room goes like, wait a second. We don't know why it went away. So we don't we don't know when it's going to come back again. And it's Friday.
And it will come back.
and it will come back, but you just don't know when. That's interesting. So this part that you mentioned where people have different perspectives and different information that they're seeing and they're making decisions accordingly. And it's fascinating when you combine all those views together, like you know exactly why something happened and what happened and eventually how you can fix it. You write, you have an amazing blog, surfingcomplexity.com. If people haven't read it, I would highly recommend. Your fascination with incidents, at least I could gather your fascination with incidents from your blog itself because you have so many posts talking about incidents in general, but not just from a software or just a technical standpoint. There is this perspective of humans too. So I was curious, like, how did you develop that perspective where you're not just thinking about like, oh, this is software and why it broke, but all the human aspects involved?
Yeah, I've been interested in the human aspects of software engineering in general for a while. I mean, like I said a little bit, like that's like what my PhD research was about, like software engineering and like studying people. But in terms of like humans as being part of the system, like the operational system, that was more like, I would say that John Allspaw like dragged me into that world. Like all the, like I'm sure you've seen many references to his stuff. Like eventually I was like, all right, John, like you're constantly posting about this stuff. I'm going to start reading about it. Right.
Yeah.
Like enough. And I started reading about it and I got completely sucked in. And like this world, like, so a lot of that sort of thinking is around that, like resilience engineering, cognitive systems engineering. There's this sort of history of research into this area. And so the cognitive system engineering people, they talk about a joint cognitive system, like a system that's composed of both the technical stuff, the software in our world, and the people, and that's all one single system. You'll often hear people talk about socio-technical system, right? So the system is not just the software, it's the software and the people together, right? And they're doing something together in a way, right? And that just, like, over time, like, that just got under my skin, and, like, I just couldn't stop seeing it anymore. And so now I always see the world that way, and a lot of people don't, like, our culture, our technical culture separates that out, right? Like there's the technical stuff, right? Like you give me the requirements and like the constraints, and I will like build that thing for you and we'll make trade-offs, right? But like technically, you know, I think in terms of cause and effect, and everyone thinks that way in technical worlds. It's not just software people, all the engineers do. But like to step back and see the people involved as part of the system, like you just see things that you wouldn't have seen before, even though you're seeing the same, right? We're seeing the same world, right? But it's just from a different point of view. And there's just so much there, right? That like, it gives me so much stuff to write about. Because people can connect because they've seen it personally, but they just might not have thought about it from that point of view.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to that, I think one of your recent posts was about what identifies as, or what can we put down as a root cause. And there were a few things which, when I first read, I remember just sending it to Guang right away. I was like, well, we're going to have so much fun in this conversation. Like one of the things that you mentioned was like, well, prioritization, for instance, was one where you can, like you mentioned earlier, the seed for an incident was planted much earlier in the process where we knew it was a ticking bomb. We just didn't prioritize it. Or like the other one was power dynamics, for instance, which is fascinating. Is your study in the socio-technical system, is that where this perspective comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. So the prioritization I love because I cannot tell you how many incidents I have seen where one of the contributing factors was some kind of like vulnerability in the system that people knew about and were working on, but they had not completed that work yet. Right? Like we knew this was a problem. We were going to address it, or we're in the process. Maybe in a few months it would have been released or something, but we had other priorities. Right? And the problem is like, you don't know the next thing that's going to break you, right? Like you always have more work that you can possibly do than like time to do it in. And so you don't know what thing is going to bite you. And so that happens again and again and again. But it's very easy to say, well, why didn't you fix that? Well, like I had a million other things. Well, I'm going to give you some more work to do, right? Like, so that's that. The power dynamics, I started thinking about more and more because I read more and more about like sort of sociological studies, of technical organizations. And I found those really, really interesting because, things like, who gets to define like what the problem is that we're trying to solve, right? Like what are the problems in this doc? Or like who gets like I said, who gets the head count, right? Like these are, and like power dynamics or like politics sounds like negative, right? But like we function in social organizations, right? Like this is how things get done. And like, it's the reality. It's just as constraining as like, I don't know, big O notation or like the CAP theorem, right? Like this is just how people interact. We have our own perspectives, right? Like different people in different parts of the stack, like they see different things, they care about different things, and they're going to advocate for the things they see from their perspectives. And that's just how people get stuff done in groups. And like, there's this belief that like there's the technical stuff, which is the good stuff that we should be doing. And then there's like the politics stuff, which is like, my company is broken. And like these things happen because of politics, not because of technical decisions. But like that, what you call politics, like that's engineering work too. It's just like, you just don't see it that way because you don't realize like how human beings actually get work done together in organizations. I got pushback for power dynamics from people. Like, no, it's not power dynamics. Like, they should have just like asked for more. They should have been able to justify more headcount. And I'm like, well, every team can justify more headcount. There's only so many resources, right? Like, this is why I talked about like rhetoric, right? Like you need to be able to like figure out how to advocate for the things you think are important, right? And you need to be able to do it in technical language, like not like people hear rhetoric and they think like, oh, I'm trying to like sell you something, right? Like it's negative. It's like I'm trying to fool you. I'm trying to like manipulate you. But I mean rhetoric in another sense of like I am trying to like persuade you of something. Like I have a position and I want to be able to communicate it to you in a way that you'll believe me. And the way we do that in our field is we write technical documents where they read as if, oh, this is the way it works. This is the way the world is, right? Like even though you've chosen the problems to describe and how you're going to solve them, like that's a political thing you've done by describing these are the problems I'm mentioning and you're not mentioning these other ones. That's going to that goes into input into people up in upper management, and they're going to use that to make decisions about things like headcount and what to invest in. And if you see that, then you're going to be more successful in an organization and getting big stuff done that you want to do.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense. So there is so much to unpack here. I have so many questions to ask, but I know we're running out of time. So I'll ask you this. Rhetoric, I saw this tweet where you mentioned that engineering and CS degrees should have a course in rhetoric, which if I think about makes so much sense for all the reasons you just mentioned. For people who, let's say, for instance, are still trying to figure out how do I convince people of an idea that I have, and it could be, here's a technical design, or here's an idea or an initiative that I want to propose. Not everyone is, I don't think it's a level playing field, because I think engineers, at least when they're starting out, technical skills are a lot more emphasized on, as opposed to some of these, for the lack of a better word, soft skills. So how do you think people can develop this rhetoric, or just write persuasively, or even speak in meetings when they have these discussions?
Yeah, I'm fortunate that I have an academic background where you kind of have to speak and write a lot. I mean, there's just like, we're forced to, like, you can't get a PhD without writing a lot of technical stuff to try to convince people of things and going and giving talks. So, I mean, I could say very flippantly, like, get a PhD, but I would not actually recommend that for someone unless they really, really wanted to do that. Cause that is not cost effective. Like, you're going to make a lot more money with those like 4 to 6 years working instead. I would say, and it depends, right? Like in a smaller company, it's not as important, right? In a larger, like it really, like in a startup, for example, like a lot of it is really spoken. Like everyone gets on the same page by talking, and you can get things done just by talking to your teammates, right? And that's how people do things on their own teams, right? It's only when things get bigger, in larger organizations that you have to rely much more on writing, right? On like startups are not memo driven cultures in the way that large organizations are. So if you want to work at a large organization, you want to succeed, advance that way. One thing I would recommend is reading. So first, read a lot. Like I just read a lot of nonfiction. I just really enjoy reading nonfiction, so it's easy for me to recommend. So I'm constantly reading something. And that's one way to get better at something, at least appreciating when it's good, right? Is to read a lot. The writing is interesting because it's really hard to write if you're not interested in something. And so the challenge with practicing writing, like I've never been able to do journaling, for example. I don't know what to write when I have a journal.
Yeah, I empathize with that. But my wife disagrees, but I empathize with that. I try over and over again. On the other hand, when I read a lot of the resilience engineering stuff, right? Like there's all these different ideas that I get exposed to that I think I understand. I'm not 100% sure. And so I use my blog as sort of a thinking out loud thing, right? Like my blog those ideas are not super sophisticated. It's always very short, like a couple of minutes of reading. And I use it to think out loud to see, do I really understand this? If I do, then I can describe it in my own words, right? And so you need a volume of ideas, that you care enough about that you want to write something about. And so once you've got that, once you're exposing yourself to ideas that you personally think are interesting enough to write about, then you just have to sort of work up the courage to write in public about. I mean, you could write in a journal for that stuff. I mean, I feel like blogs, people have permission to just similar to podcasts, right? Like they're not super polished, right? We talk off the cuff. I'm sure I've said ridiculous things, but people don't really care that much, right? Like it's ephemeral.
Twitter, I've used Twitter for that, but it's not a good idea to use Twitter to like to have like half baked thoughts. It's just not. It's not the right environment. It's too easy to do, but it's not the right environment for that. But blogging is great for that. And so sometimes I have no new ideas. I won't write anything for weeks, and sometimes I'll write like 2 posts in a day. Another thing I do, so I'm a big fan of what's called like ubiquitous capture, where like I carry index cards around with me, and if I have an idea, I write it down and go over it later. That's like from Getting Things Done. So I'm a big Getting Things Done fan. There's a book I really like, which I read many years ago, and then I bought again recently. I actually have it on my bookshelf here. It's called Weinberg on Writing, The Fieldstone Method. So it's by a guy named Gerald Weinberg. He wrote a book called like The Psychology of Computer Programming back in like, I want to say like the 70s or 80s. But he's written like, I don't know, 30 books or something. And he has a great description of like how to sort of collect these ideas as you go, like so that you can accumulate these sorts of things. And I find his book, it's my favorite book on like how to become a better writer, but just like how to come up with ideas for stuff to write about. Because if you don't have anything that you care about, then it doesn't matter. You're not really going to be able to write, I don't think.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Do you have any other books that you would recommend to folks, either on writing or something that you've just read and you thought at least folks in this industry could just learn from?
Yeah, two books that I've read recently that have had big influence on me. One is called Designing Engineers, by Louis Bucciarelli, I think his last name is. So it was written by an MIT professor of engineering who did an ethnographic study of engineers. He went into a bunch of different engineering companies and just like watched them do design work. And it's a really great book because like it had a lot of influence on me and like the role of like the social process in design. And he goes and sits there and he sees like they're arguing and like there's this meeting where this engineer wants to like, okay, here's like the possible solutions to this technical problem we have, right? Now we're going to go through this process to figure out like how to rank them. And then they all start arguing over like, no, like what's the actual, like what should we actually care about? Like, we haven't even defined the problem really yet. And he's like, oh, that meeting was a total waste. But actually, like the research was like, well, no, like people like didn't have like a shared understanding of the problem. And like you were developing that as you were talking. So he saw it as a total waste. The guy who ran the meeting who wanted like a 14, to rank order the 14 possible solutions. So I love that book because like, whether or not you think that software engineers are engineers, when you read that stuff and he says like naming is part of design and naming is really hard and like, you're like, well, that sounds pretty familiar to me. Like, and he's talking about mechanical engineers. The other one I read recently is called Mission Improbable by an author named Lee Clark. And he talks about, he wrote about like disaster recovery documents for situations that like no one could actually know how to recover from them. So things like what happens after a nuclear war, or like how do we, like, what do people do in that situation? Or what happens after a nuclear meltdown or like a huge oil spill? And his conclusion is that like, well, we don't actually know. We don't have experience with these things, but they're written as if they know, so that the expert, like they have like symbolic value to convince people that like, we understand this problem. Don't worry about it. And that has like influenced me a lot on the rhetorical point, because it's written in like technical language by experts. So like, this is what would happen. Like, this is how we would evacuate Long Island if like there was a nuclear meltdown there at the power plant. And just that notion of like, power dynamics being cloaked in technical writing, had a lot of influence on me. And that's one of the reasons why you keep seeing me talk about this sort of stuff.
I see. We'll definitely link to both of these books in the show notes.
What I find super interesting about this conversation, right, is that I feel like when I think about these sort of things, right, it's like a lot of engineers, I think, tend to focus on just like the technical aspect, but then there's this whole sort of gap between sort of what they actually see the results versus sort of, and I think a lot of times it's very comforting to just focus on the technical stuff because that's what you know well. It's very easy to measure, right? Like it's like, oh, I built out these many features, what happens? But what you really like to focus on are the things that are harder to measure, But a lot of times that's sort of, and because a lot of times, right, like you hear, I don't know, I hear complaints from my like friends who are engineering or who are in engineering who are like, yo, why is this not working out, right? Like I've done, all this stuff, but what they're not looking at is that sort of that gap, right? And I think kind of translating from what you just talked about in terms of, how you look at incidents and writing and rhetorics, translating that to metrics. So you've wrote about this article kind of preferring sort of qualitative signals over quantitative. I thought that was super interesting read. If you can just like provide a little bit of context in terms of like a TLDR on the post, that'd be super great.
Yeah. So man, we love metrics, don't we? And the reason
more
we
numbers.
more number, and to be fair to management, right? Like our systems, like as an organization, they're really big, right? And like even if you're a director or VP and you can spend all your time doing one-on-ones with people, and you're still like not going to see everything that's going on, right? And metrics make the system intelligible. I can understand, right? I can manage that system because like I have this number and I can see it going up or down, even though there's this huge thing with all sorts of different people. So I understand like the appeal of metrics because it makes like the management problem tractable, right? So that's attractive. And like we engineers like, I'll tell you, I use metrics for like alerting on my system, right? Like my software, I'm not doing qualitative analysis. I mean, when I do logs, I do qualitative, but like, no, in that case, like I can put good metrics in. But if you want to really, so what I found is if you want to actually get as much as you can from the system. So a couple things. So one is that like metrics necessarily are throwing out a lot of information, right? That's what they do, right? We collapse the world into like a few things, which means you're going to miss a lot of stuff, right? And I'm always worried about all the stuff that we are missing because the stuff that the organization doesn't see, that's where the danger is. That's the stuff that doesn't get the resources. That's the stuff where like, if you're not measuring burnout, and your people start to burn out, but you're measuring attrition, you're too late, right? Like you do not want to get people into that death spiral. So I am always worried about the signals that are not measured with metrics. So like no matter how many metrics you add for me, I'm going to be like, well, what are you not seeing? Right. And the other thing that I personally find very frustrating about metrics. So, whenever you're dealing with metrics, so like, on the core team, you have to measure like when does the incident start and stop, right? And like what category does it go into, right? Like that time that you spend, like, okay, the metric like dropped to here at this minute and then there to this minute. Where should we say it start? Like there's no value to the organization in that time you spend like picking which minute it started at, or like, okay, is this like a latent bug or is this a recent one? Like it's an interaction of two things. Is it because of like, I don't know, like this external service, right? Like that time you spend to figure out what bucket to put something in, that is all waste, right? Like you're not learning anything, right? That's all opportunity cost. But if you are doing qualitative analysis, if you are learning more about the system, you're talking like, how did we get it? Like, how did this happen? Right? Like you are going to, there's always an opportunity for you to see something, to learn something about the system that you didn't know before. Now, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll spend a lot of time and you won't get anything, right? It's possible. I mean, I have always learned something from all the qualitative analysis I've done on incidents. And one of the things you get better at is like, given you have a limited amount of time, you got to pick the stuff that seems like it's most promising, right? Like based on like your intuition and your hints. But never feel like my time is wasted when I'm doing qualitative analysis. I'm always learning more about a system, and every like incident and surprise is like an indication there's something about your system that you didn't know that was really important, right? But like metrics, like the collection of the metrics itself, that work, there's no learning. And the insight that you get from the metrics, I have always found that any insight you can get from quantitative metrics, you can get more insight from qualitative with the same amount of work, right? So that's like my like claim, right? So that's why I think qualitative is better than quantitative, is that any effort you spend on quantitative metrics, I think you would get like more insight. If that's what you care about, you get more insight if you spent that time doing qualitative instead. And you're not going to annoy your engineers at like, having them spend time, doing arbitrary bucketing. And then you also don't have the horrible, I'm not even talking about like the effect where like people like, do things to make the metrics look good. Right? That's another problem. Like already, right? And like you hear this like at different places where they're like chasing metrics instead of doing with like anytime my favorite metric is like how many times did someone have to make a decision between doing what they felt was right and doing what they or doing what would increase the metric, right? Like that's a metric I would like to see, because every time that happens, that's bad, and that should be 0, and it never is. But qualitative, you don't have that problem because it's all based on judgment.
And talking about judgment, like I feel like in theory, I definitely agree with what you said, but I feel like it's hard to apply that to like every company. So do you think like the sort of the Netflix culture of having like freedom and responsibility being like a very much a necessary condition for this to thrive, such that you're giving individual engineers sort of the trust and to kind of do the right thing here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think that like you need to have this is like one of the, I don't know, like tenets of resilience engineering. Like the people who like the people, they call it the sharp end, the people who are like actually like on the front lines, like they need to have initiative. They need to be able to make decisions in the moment about what to do. Right. And so you have to be able to trust their judgment, because if you like centralize that, if you have to like, has to go up the chain to get it, and it has to come back down, you're going to be too slow and they're going to miss things. Right. And so I would say it's not even sufficient, but it's necessary. And one of the things I love about Netflix is that the engineers do have a lot of like initiative and autonomy, and like the guidelines are use your best judgment, right? Like what do you think is best for Netflix? That's what you should do. Now, different people on different teams will disagree on what's best, right? And so there are lots of cat herding challenges when we don't have like mandates on things. But I really do think that like people having initiative and you letting people use their best judgment about what to do is super important to be able to use these sorts of approaches.
And maybe a follow-up that might not have a great answer to, but I was still curious to get your thoughts on, is like for someone, say like an IC working at a company, maybe the culture is not as strong in that regard, where there are a lot of hoops. Like, are there any actionable sort of tips that you have that they can sort of either try to drive the change in terms of culture, but if that's too hard, anything that they can do sort of to make a small change for the better?
Yeah, I've never worked in a company like that. I can say what I would try. I can say what I would try to do. I don't know if it will be successful or not, but what I would try to do is sort of guerrilla style, like on the side, do some like lead by example stuff with like, so one thing that I try to do on my team is write up when we have operational surprises, whether I'm involved or not. I don't have enough time, so it doesn't happen. But like to say like, look, like I'm doing like this sort of work, and here's the value, right? And like you either see the value or you don't, right? And some people won't see the value. And so you sort of have to like infect people. You've got to get like people sort of higher up to see value in this work. So you've got to do a little bit of it, and have them see it. And then, maybe they'll either go along or not. That might not work. In many cases, it probably won't, but at least like, it's one thing to sort of say like, look, we really should do this. But it's another thing to actually try to carve out some time, do it yourself and show them and get like sort of create demand for it by trying to sort of on the side, do it yourself. Now, like I was doing stuff on the side and then I was like, no, I don't want to do it on the side anymore. But on the other hand, I was able to make space for that when I think like that work that I did helped me make space for moving on to the core team and doing that. But I had like a sponsor. I had someone on that team who was an IC who became the manager who just really believed in that work. And I think part of it was he saw the work I was doing, but part of it was that he was like, I'll say like a humanist, like he saw the human's parts. And so like, a huge factor in whether this succeeds or fails is like your management change. So there's like organizational culture, but like in big companies, like the culture is also very, very local, right? Like individual teams. I can tell you, having been on 3 teams at Netflix, individual team cultures are very different. And so, you can sort of either change your team or change your team, like you can.
Damn, that's a good quote. I like it.
I don't think it's actually mine, but like you can sort of convince people or not.
Makes sense. In this case, so I think the one that you referred to, or the initiative that you took about talking about the near misses. I think Oops is the project that you named it. Okay, that's a good name. With the qualitative analysis and something like the Oops project, where people are talking about some of the near misses that happened, which didn't result into an incident, but someone caught it one way or the other. Someone knew the system very well, or there was a signal that told them it's going to blow up. And I'm going to try and tie it back to the recent post we discussed earlier, which was about some of the interesting root causes that could be mentioned on incidents. Have you been able to convince the core team or other teams at Netflix to use any one of those as a root cause in an incident, where it's like prioritization becomes one?
So, I mean, it depends on who's doing the incident, right? I mean, we don't have like a canned list of you know, I mean, we don't call them root causes, right? Contributing factors is the term that we use. I have never seen power dynamics as a contributing factor. I don't think I could even put it there. Like, I don't think I could put it there, right? Like, you know, so I don't think prioritization, like, what I have put is like, you know, this work was being done, right? So like the work that would have like prevented this if it had gotten done yet was still in progress, right? So that doesn't, I don't think I might not have labeled it prioritization, but at least try to describe it. So that goes a little bit to like bucketing. Like I try to like, here's a description of what it was. The hard part then becomes like, how do you aggregate across a bunch of different ones, right? So you have a bunch of different incident write-ups. Okay. Like, what do I do with that? Right? Like you can't just hand management. Here's like, you know, here's 30, 20 page write-ups. Like, you know, now figure out like, you know, where to invest in like reducing risk, right? Like that's terrible. Like they're going to say, go away. Like, why are you wasting my time? So like doing that thematic analysis though is hard. And I was doing this with a teammate with, Ryan Kitchens, who's still on the core team. And then like COVID hit. And like it just fell down. But like we had categories like themes like something somebody didn't know is one of my favorite ones, right? Like there's like some piece of context that's not shared between two different people in the organization. And so that's a common, you know, contributor to incidents. But I think that's sort of like the next step. And it's just very difficult to do because of like, you know, who gets to pick those categories? How do you know, and like, but like being able to do that, I would not put power dynamics, myself, because, you know, and then what do you even do with that? Right. Like you could put that on every incident, in a sense, you know, I don't, it's a fact of life. I mean, maybe that would help ICs see the value of, you know, the role of things like, you know, docs and stuff, but I don't know.
No, that makes sense. So you were on the core team. Thanks for being there. Thanks for running Netflix for us. You have two happy customers here, and your streaming viewership went up, I'm assuming, significantly due to the circumstances today with COVID and all. But you've moved on to a different team now, towards the managed delivery team. Before we close, do you want to share what you are doing on the managed delivery team?
Yeah, I'm really a traditional software engineer on the managed delivery team. So I don't have any, you know, particularly, you know, interesting role there. Like I'm just one of the software engineers because I'm more operationally minded, on the team. I, you know, do a little bit more stuff with like the alerts and dashboards. We have like a This Week in Managed Delivery Operations meeting where we talk about like what are the interesting things that happened this week in operations, and like how did you figure out what the problem was, and like sort of like you could think of it as being very sort of lightweight versions of like incident write-ups where we're just talking in a meeting, if there's something interesting that happened. So I'm kind of trying to, you know, like upskill like everyone on the team on the operations stuff and make that sort of work more visible. But I switched onto that team because I thought that the problem space of like increasing the automation in the delivery system was like really interesting. And like, I can imagine all sorts of crazy things going wrong, with automation. Like, I don't know if I'm an automation skeptic, but I definitely appreciate that like, as you increase automation and as you add safety stuff, like it gets weirder, the failure modes. And I am a little like, so one of the trends we're seeing at Netflix is that like we're trying to provide higher level abstractions to the app owners, which means that they are going to be in some level responsible for less operations work. And that scares me a little bit. And so I want to figure out like, how do we build automation in a way to make like to surface some of the operation stuff to them to make it more visible so that like we don't just end up as a magic black box where if something goes wrong, nobody knows like what the heck is going on, right? Like that's always the danger that like, when it works, it's great. And when it doesn't, like, I don't know how this thing works. I don't know what it's doing. Why? It's been 8 minutes. Why isn't this thing deploying yet?
Restart.
Like,
It didn't work again.
right? So I just thought it was a really interesting space to be in. So
Makes sense. And by the way, this managed delivery, is this more like on software delivery or this is more content delivery?
software delivery. So this is deployment. So you can think of this as like a replacement for like a traditional like pipeline based system where you're like describing like, here are my environments. I've got a testing environment, a staging, and a prod. And like to go from test to staging, these tests have to run. And then to go from like here to here, like you have to do like a manual judgment, or you could like say, okay, I want to pin back to this version, and it'll figure out, I want to mark this version as bad. It'll figure automatically which one to pin back to. So like, treating traditionally like pipelines, you can think of them like, like sort of the equivalent of like bash scripts for like how deployments go. And here it's more like a real software system, like understanding the domain more about like how the code flows through the different environments. So, I mean, we'll see. It's like it's sort of an experimenty thing.
Yeah. Sounds fun.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the close, and this is one question we like to ask everyone, and we would love to get your answer for this one. Like, what was a tool that you recently discovered and liked?
I've become a really big fan of Roam Research. So I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's like, if you look at it, you're like, oh, it's like an outliner and a wiki. Big deal. That's not very interesting. But like that combination with like a wiki with like backlinks, right? Okay. It's an outliner and a wiki with backlinks. But so I read this like How to Take Smart Notes book about like, I don't know if that book's sort of been going around about like Zettelkasten. There's this whole world of people who like accumulate like ideas on index cards and stuff and use them. But basically it's a tool that I find very useful for organizing like my thoughts. Like I really like outliners, and like the outliner wiki combination just works really, really well. There's this like entire like subculture of people who like are super into it and like I don't use the extensions, but they put all sorts of extensions in there. But I really, really like Roam Research, and like I've stuck with it in a way that I have not stuck with other tools for like keeping track of things. And so I would recommend people check it out.
Oh, that's pretty neat. It also creates these graphs and connections based on all the ideas you put in, right?
It does that. I don't really use that very often. It's kind of a novelty, I think, but it does do that. Yeah.
And it's ROAM, Roam Research.
Yeah.
Cool. At first I thought like Rome, the city, and I thought it was going to be like an art thing. I was like, ooh.
No.
Sorry for being a peasant. Please continue.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. So, Lorin, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners today?
Yeah. So if anyone's sort of interested in the human aspects of learning from incidents and learning more about them, there's this great website called Learning from Incidents in Software. It's at learningfromincidents.io. It's sort of like a community of people who are similarly minded and are trying to move away from, sort of simple like metric-y approaches to incidents to more like the narrative and like how do we learn more about like what happened. So I definitely encourage you to check it out.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll certainly link to it in the show notes as well. It was learningfromincidents.io.
Yeah.
Awesome. By the way, I saw I remember going through this website, and there were some familiar names on the page, in the About page. I think John Alspaugh, Nora Jones, yourself, and a few others.
Yep. Yeah, so Richard Cook, Jessica DeVito, Will Gallego, Ryan Kitchens, Laura McGuire. Those are all people in this community.
Nice. That's awesome. We'll certainly recommend all our listeners to check it out. So, Lorin, before we let you go, one last question. I said that the other one was going to be the last one, but you have on your shirt, should I deploy on a Friday at 5 p.m.? What's the answer to that? We got to answer that.
So have you seen my...
there's a flow chart.
Yeah, it's a flow chart.
For our audience who are not seeing this, I think the safe answer is no.
No. and like I wear this shirt every single Friday, and I will say, it's everyone who so there are people who love to fight over this on the internet, right?
Yes.
But everyone who has seen my shirt at Netflix loves my shirt. Even people who deploy on Friday afternoons, especially people who I have deployed Friday afternoon wearing this shirt. So I think it's hilarious. I just love it.
That's a good shirt. I think we all need to get one. This has been awesome, Lorin. Thank you so much for taking the time with us.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to the show. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and learn more about us at softwaremisadventures.com. You can also write to us at hello@softwaremisadventures.com. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, take care.